All right, so in this video, we're going to try to make it as interactive as possible. Okay, so how this is going to work is I'm going to present to you a rule, and then I want you to try to diagram it to the best of your ability. Just give it your best shot. And then after you complete your diagram, go ahead and resume the video, and then we'll check to see how you did. Okay, so one thing to just kind of keep in mind before we dive in is you want to consider these rules as sequencing rules. Okay, so you may have also heard these being called like linear or ordering games. They all mean the exact same thing. This is where the layout looks something like this, where you have a series of slots going in a very particular order. And generally speaking, you're going to just have one entity showing up within each slot. Okay, so that's how I want you to consider these rules. And so let's go ahead and take a look at the first rule. So the first rule says G and P are separated by 2 spaces. So go ahead and pause the video and give this one a shot. Okay, so we're going to first kind of just run through how to diagram this. And then after that, we're also going to talk about the common mistake that people make when it comes to this rule. So we have 2 spaces between G and P, right? So this is going to mean we have G, 2 spaces, and then P. So a good rule of thumb to go by is you want to just imagine what the rule would look like if it were somewhere on the game board, right? At this point, I don't want to put this directly on the game board because I don't know exactly where G and P would go, but I can imagine what G and P would look like if it were to show up on the game board. And so that's what we're going to try to emulate here. Now, another thing to kind of keep in mind, though, is I actually know the exact distance between G and P in this case, right? So for that reason, I'm going to put a box around it. That's just going to really emphasize to me that this rule is restricted in that regard. Now, one common mistake that people make, though, is they just leave it at this. But remember, all we know is that G and P are separated by 2 spaces. We don't know anything about the order between G and P. And so we want to emphasize that point because sometimes you will have rules where G actually needs to go before P. So for that reason, I'm going to put what's called a switch here. Okay, so this is probably the best way to diagram this particular rule. I have seen some people try to split it up where they'll have one game board where G goes before P, another game board where P goes before G. And there is a time and place for that, but that's not always going to be necessary. Okay, let's take a look at the next rule. The next rule says there are at least 2 spaces between M and R. Go ahead and give this one a try. Okay, so this is pretty similar to the previous rule, right? We still have that terminology about 2 spaces being between them, but in this case, it's at least 2. Okay, so I need to emphasize that. So at least 2 means there could be more than 2 between M and R, right? So there's 2 ways I can depict that. Either one works fine. So one is I could do a plus sign with an R. Okay, that implies that there could be more spaces between. Or you could also do a dotted line and then R. Okay, so this ellipses indicates that there could be more spaces between M and R. But we certainly don't want to leave it like this because as we just saw, there will be rules where we actually have exactly 2 between them, and we need to be able to distinguish between those 2 scenarios. Another thing is, just like with the previous rule, again, we don't know the order between M and R, right? We just know the number of spaces between them. So for that reason, I would again need to use a switch here. Okay, let's move on to the next rule. So the next rule says K goes 4 spaces after P. Go ahead and pause the video and give this one a shot. Okay, so this is a very, very tricky rule for most people in the beginning, and this is where a lot of people start to say they hate the LSAC. And I'm not going to confirm or deny how I feel about that one. But so this rule seems very similar to the previous ones, right? We again are talking about the distance between the 2 entities, but I oftentimes see people diagramming it like this. Or I'm sorry, it would actually be K going after P, so it would look more so like this. And the mistake here is people just kind of see the number 4 and then they get too attached to it, okay? But the correct way to diagram this, believe it or not, is actually like this. Okay, so let's talk about why. So I'm going to start off with just one of these letters. It doesn't really matter which one. Let's say I just start with P, okay? Now remember, we're saying K goes 4 spaces after P, so I'm going to count 4 spaces after P. Okay, so this is 1 space, 2 spaces, 3 spaces, and 4 spaces, right? Now, this is where it gets interesting though. If we're saying K goes 4 spaces after P, that actually means K is on the 4th space after P, which is this space. So for that reason, K actually would show up here, okay? And so that's how I want you to think about it. And then from here, notice how there's no at least. And in this case, we actually do know the order, right? K has to go after P. So for that reason, we don't put a switch in this situation, and we would just simply box it. So this would be our final diagram. So I know what you're probably thinking at this point. You might be asking yourself, well, how the heck am I supposed to recognize that, right? How am I supposed to recognize that in this situation, 4 doesn't actually represent the spaces between them? Well, the answer to that is you want to actually keep an eye out for 2 specific keywords, okay? And the 2 keywords are separated and between. Now, if you see either of these 2 keywords, I want you to keep in mind that these translate into in the middle. Okay, so if I see this, that actually translates to the number of spaces in the middle of the 2 entities. Okay, so if we go back to the G and P rule, right? G and P are separated by 2 spaces. Notice how we have one of these terms. We have the term separated. Okay, so what that in turn means for me is the number 2 is the number of spaces in the middle of G and P. So that is why our final diagram ends up looking like this, okay? And then of course, again, we have the switch there. However, when we don't have either of these 2 keywords, that's when it becomes problematic, okay? That's when we have to be much more careful, right? If we go back to the K goes 4 spaces after P, notice how we don't have either of those 2 words. So that's where you then want to count out the spaces like I did. Or if you want to get real technical with it, you could even say that you're just going to take the whatever number is provided, right? In this case, it's 4, and then you just subtract 1 from it, and that's going to be the number of spaces in the middle, right? So if I take 4, subtract 1, that's 3, and notice how that ends up being the number of spaces in the middle of P and K. Okay, so that's a cool little trick you can use to make sure you're diagramming correctly. Okay, let's move on to the next rule. So again, pause the video and give this one a shot. Okay, so a lot of times people get confused when they start to see higher numbered, right? They don't really comprehend what that means. And a real simple way to think about this is to just refer to the game board when in doubt. Okay, so we have, let's just say we have 5 spaces and it's just a standard sequencing game. Now, what would a higher numbered slot be, right? Well, 3 is a higher numbered slot than 2. 2 is a higher numbered slot than 1, and so on, right? So higher numbered slot means further to the right, okay? So the correct way to diagram this particular rule would simply be Z ellipses M, or alternatively, you could also do a Z with a dash to M. Either of those works just fine. But what about if these were rankings, right? Imagine if this particular game was actually ranking entities from 1 through 5. Well, in that case, what if this rule were instead to say M is in a higher rank than Z? Well, let's think about that in terms of the game board, right? So slot 1 would be rank 1, but first place is actually a higher ranking than second place. Second place is actually a higher ranking than third place. So if we were to say M is a higher rank than Z, it would actually look like this. This would actually be the correct diagram. Okay, so that's why understanding the situation that is provided to you within the game is also important to comprehend. Okay, we got one more rule. And again, pause the video and return back to it once you're ready. Okay, so this is a pretty challenging one, right? And what we're going to do here is I'm going to first kind of break it up into pieces. There's a lot of stuff going on in this rule, right? So whenever that happens, whenever it gets complicated and you have trouble juggling things around, just break it up into smaller parts. So if you think about it, there's kind of three main parts to this rule. We have Q goes later than H, Q goes later than N, and then we have but not both. So I'm going to diagram out each of those parts one by one. So Q goes later than H. That's going to look like this. Then we have Q goes later than N, which looks like this. And I'm also going to put an or here. And then finally, we have not both. Now, some people neglect the not both, thinking that or already implies that. But we want to be careful about that because or actually does not imply not both. I know that in everyday life, we tend to use or in the sense of A or B, but not both, right? We just consider it to be one to the exclusion of the other. But when it comes to the LSAT, or actually means at least one. Okay, so if I just had or without the not both, it actually means that both of these could happen at the same time. Okay, so that's a very important distinction. So that's one thing to keep in mind regarding the meaning of or. But now let's take a look at what this means in terms of not both, right? So what if this situation were to happen? What if that part was satisfied? Well, that would actually mean that this part would not be satisfied, right? Because if this were also to happen, then I would actually have both of those possibilities occurring, right? And the same thing on the other side as well. If this side were to happen, then this side can't happen because otherwise both sides would happen, and that would thereby break the not both portion of the rule. But also notice how both parts of these rules contain Q. Okay, so there's a repeated entity here, which tells me that there's likely to be some type of relationship between the two parts. So let's consider that real quick. So let's go back. If this were to happen, then N does not go before Q. But wait a second, this is a standard sequencing game. So then what would that mean? Well, the only other option for N and Q in this case is actually for Q to go before N. Okay. So for that reason, I can actually link it up. I'm going to just diagram it off to the bottom here. So if Q goes before N, this would actually be the entire scenario for this first situation, right? And notice how now I've actually accounted for the not both. It's already taken care of. So then what about the second option? Okay, so then we have N goes before Q. But if N goes before Q, then this no longer happens, meaning H actually must go after Q. So I can link that up just like this. So now I've accounted for the not both for both options. So I can ignore this portion now, right? And so technically speaking, yes, this could be your final diagram, but notice how we can even take it a step further. So one thing to note is both of these situations have something in common, which is just that Q goes between H and N, regardless of the order of those two entities. So I can in turn simplify this diagram to become this, or alternatively, you could also do something like this. Either of those is totally fine. Okay, so this would be our final diagram. So I hope this video kind of brings up an important point, which is that a lot of us take diagramming for granted. We think that the diagramming is not the important part of the game. We need to spend most of our time focusing on the questions and the deductions. And those things are all true, right? Those are also very important. The deductions and the rules, the deductions and the questions are very important, no doubt. However, if we don't have a solid understanding of how to diagram the rules, it would kind of be like not really understanding vocabulary before learning a language. Okay, so take the time to really practice these diagrams and make sure you fully understand them, because you'll start to notice that the same rules are recycled over and over again on LSATs. So I hope you guys found that helpful. If you guys found this helpful, please consider liking and subscribing for more content. And also feel free to check out my website, www.impetuslsat.com, where you can get access to private tutoring or a Logic Games course as well. Okay, I'll see you guys in the next video.